Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that is going to completely shatter the divide between the secular and the spiritual, especially when it comes to money. We are drawing strictly on the really fascinating insights of Lee Jenkins, who is a pastor, an entrepreneur, and a former Wall Street executive. If you've ever felt a disconnect between your faith and your finances, well, you are definitely not alone. But today, let's reframe practically everything you thought you knew.
Okay, let's dive right into this. 2,350. That is the actual number of verses in the Bible that deal specifically with how to handle money and possessions. Out of roughly 38 parables that Jesus told, around 16 deal directly with finances. He actually talked more about money than he did about faith or even heaven and hell.
So that brings us to a massive point of cognitive dissonance, right? With over 2,000 verses of financial guidance sitting right there in the text, why are so many people in faith communities genuinely scared of wealth? Why is money so often viewed as kind of carnal, unspiritual, or just strictly secular when the text clearly treats it as a deeply spiritual issue?
To answer that, we really need to understand exactly where this stigma comes from. Section 1. The stigma of wealth. We're going to look at one guy's absolutely wild life story that proves this entire stigma wrong.
Check out this roller coaster timeline of Lee Jenkins. He grew up in inner-city poverty in Atlanta, literally sometimes wondering where his next meal was going to come from. In his 20s, he found a way out. He got drafted into the NFL by the New York Giants, but his career was instantly crushed by injuries. He didn't give up, though. He pivoted hard. By his 30s, he was this highly successful multi-millionaire stockbroker on Wall Street. But then the 2008 financial crash hit, and he lost a whopping 75% of his net worth. That moment of holy discontentment led him to finally surrender to ministry, and he became a pastor and a stewardship coach. Jenkins has unparalleled credibility here, simply because he has lived at the absolute highest peaks and the lowest valleys of both the marketplace and the pulpit.
Because of that super unique background, Jenkins drops this incredibly powerful observation. He says, too many Christians are scared of wealth, and they don't understand the power of it and how it can be used for good. When people believe deep down that there's something inherently wrong with building wealth, they hide their potential. They kind of back away from success, and in doing so, they lose the very influence and resources they need to make a massive, positive impact on the world.
And that brings us to Section 2, a biblical paradigm shift. We are going to reframe some very familiar biblical history, but strictly through an economic lens.
For instance, let's think about Jesus the businessman. Long before his 3-year public ministry went viral, Jesus spent decades working in the marketplace. When he finally stood up to preach in his hometown, the crowd didn't say, "Hey, look at the great religious scholar." Nope, they rhetorically asked, "Isn't this the carpenter's son?" They knew him by his marketplace brand. He spent the vast majority of his life building a business reputation, managing a budget, working with clients, and handling practical affairs. That's exactly why, when it was time to recruit his disciples, he didn't go to the temple to find a bunch of religious scholars. He went straight to the marketplace to recruit tax collectors and fishermen, people with deep, practical ingenuity.
So the crucial point here is captured perfectly in Luke 16:11. Jesus asks, "If therefore you have not been faithful in the use of worldly wealth, who will entrust the true riches to you?" He literally viewed the handling of practical, secular, worldly finance as the ultimate test for spiritual trustworthiness. I mean, think about it. If you can't manage a budget or handle a business with integrity, how can you be trusted with eternal spiritual responsibilities?
Which leads us directly into Section 3, money equals influence. It's a pretty bold truth. But without resources, even the absolute best wisdom often goes completely unheard.
Ecclesiastes 9:16 puts it bluntly. Those who are wise will be despised if they are poor. What they say will not be appreciated for long. Jenkins experienced this directly on Wall Street. Back when he was a young, broke stockbroker sitting in a cubicle, absolutely no one cared about his opinions or his Bible studies. But 10 years later, when he was in the top 5% of producers in his firm making millions, suddenly everyone wanted to sit at his feet and listen to him. His wisdom hadn't changed one bit, but his influence had skyrocketed because of his financial success.
And this brilliantly illustrates something essential. Money is simply an amoral tool. It isn't good, it isn't bad, it just amplifies the true condition of your heart. For example, the rich young ruler held so tightly to his wealth that he walked away from Jesus sad, losing his eternal destiny. But Zacchaeus, who was also incredibly rich, encountered Jesus and immediately used his massive wealth to pay back everyone he had wronged 4 times over.
It's the exact same amoral tool, but with two entirely different heart conditions.
Or, consider Joseph of Arimathea. He wasn't one of the 12 disciples, but he was a major wealthy marketplace leader. When Jesus was crucified, none of the disciples had the political or economic clout to approach Pontius Pilate. But Joseph did. He used his wealth and his influence to ask for the body of Jesus, rescuing it from being thrown into a mass grave and placed it in a purchased tomb. He is the ultimate biblical archetype for using business and wealth to step in and rescue the vulnerable.
Now let's fast forward from ancient biblical history to modern practical application in Section 4, the hybrid real estate model. We're going to look at how Jenkins applies this exact marketplace ingenuity to church assets today.
So for decades, the traditional strategy has been pretty inefficient. The ministry does all the heavy lifting, collecting donations just to pay for massive real estate that basically sits empty and dormant 6 days a week. Jenkins realized this was terrible stewardship of a major asset, so he flipped the script to a hybrid strategy. What if the real estate itself generates commercial revenue that actually pays for the ministry?
Here is how his church, Eagle's Nest, actually pulled this off. They didn't just buy a building, they purchased an entire 16-acre shopping mall. A portion of it operates as their sanctuary and an event center, but they lease the surrounding commercial bays out to local businesses. That rental income acts as this powerful economic engine that directly funds their ministry. It completely confused the traditional banks, who had absolutely no idea how to underwrite a hybrid religious commercial entity. But it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that sharp marketplace ingenuity absolutely belongs in the church. It turned a Sunday building into a daily, thriving community hub.
Let's move to and see how this builds into our final section, Section 5, the stewardship tier list. This is a rapid-fire tier list ranking the absolute best and worst financial strategies in today's economy, straight from a 25-year Wall Street veteran.
Okay, let's start at the very top. At S tier, the ultimate level is the 10% tithe in giving. Why? Because putting the kingdom first frees God up to bless you. Also sitting in S tier is AI and tech, which Jenkins equates to the early days of the internet. It's literally the next massive generational wealth shift. Real estate rounds out S tier as the absolute bedrock of generational wealth. Moving down to A tier, we've got having a 3 to 6 month emergency fund, because as the Bible says, it rains on the just and the unjust, right? And surprisingly high in A tier are blue-collar jobs, because skilled, hands-on labor is highly resistant to being replaced by artificial intelligence.
Now let's look at the lower tiers. Debt elimination is only B tier, which might sound weird, but we'll explain why in just a second. Dropping down to C tier is the traditional college degree, which Jenkins notes has severely diminishing returns these days unless you are highly specialized. Even lower, at D tier, are white-collar jobs. Why? Because unlike blue-collar work, the AI revolution is coming straight for those standard white-collar tasks. And finally, F tier is joining an MLM strictly to get rich quick, because wrong motives almost always lead to poor stewardship.
So let's clarify why debt elimination was only ranked as B tier. I mean, isn't all debt just bad? Actually, scratch that. It's not. Jenkins draws a massive line between dumb debt and strategic debt. Strategic debt is when you use borrowed capital to buy assets that increase in value over time. It's debt used to fund specialized education or coaching that directly increases your money-making potential. Obviously, the best debt is no debt, but leveraging capital strategically is a really powerful wealth-building tool.
What's really crazy is that this concept of strategic debt is deeply biblical. Take the story of the widow and the oil. She was completely flat broke, but the prophet Elisha didn't tell her to just sit there and do nothing. He commanded her to go out and borrow as many empty vessels as she could find. She literally went into strategic debt to gather the business inventory she needed. God multiplied the oil, she sold it, paid off her debts, and bought her freedom. The size of her blessing was directly tied to her willingness to think big and leverage those resources.
Which brings us to our final provocative question. Does your financial belief system reflect God's desire for you to be a person of major influence? If you buy and sell every single day, but still view money as purely secular, you are leaving your greatest tool for impact on the table. It is time to stop avoiding wealth, stop being scared of the marketplace, and start leveraging your resources to flip culture upside down. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.